The silence in a forest is never truly silent. If you listen close enough, really listen, you can hear its heartbeat. In the Nantahala National Forest, that heartbeat is a low, persistent hum. It's a vibration you feel more than you hear. A physical presence that sits in the back of your throat. Some locals call it the heavy air. Scientists have a name for it too. Infrasound. But for David Thorne, it was just a feeling, a deep, unsettling thrum in his bones. David was a land surveyor, a man who trusted logic, coordinates, and the unchangeable facts of topography. In October of 2024, he took a job that would challenge everything he believed. He was hired to map a 400-acre blind spot, a piece of land tucked away near the Great Smoky Mountains that modern satellites could unteam to penetrate. He arrived on October 4th, as the autumn leaves were turning the color of rust and fire. He set up his base camp deep in a valley the old-timers called Devil's Throat. The first few days were routine. Up at dawn, coffee, gear check, and into the dense woods. But on day 4, something changed. The forest fell silent. The usual morning chorus of birds simply vanished the moment the sun crested the ridge. David stood in a clearing, the air heavy and still, and realized he couldn't hear anything. Not a bird, not an insect, not even the rustle of a squirrel, just the sound of his own pulse pounding in his ears. He checked his high-end GPS. The device, usually accurate to within centimeters, was hunting. The coordinate numbers flickered erratically, unable to lock on. "Great," he said aloud, his voice sounding shockingly loud in the quiet. "Iron deposits." He chalked it up to magnetic interference from the gorge and got to work. Later that afternoon, while hammering survey stakes, he found the first arrangement. In a small clearing between 2 massive oak trees, hundreds of smooth, gray river stones were laid out in a perfect circle, 10 feet across. In the center was a pile of deer bones. They weren't scattered as if by a predator. They were stacked, ribs at the bottom, then vertebrae, with the skull placed neatly on top, facing due north. A cold chill ran down David's spine. The nearest river was 2 miles away, through a nearly impassable thicket of rhododendron. Someone had carried all of these stones, hundreds of pounds of them, up here for a reason he didn't want to contemplate. By the second week, sleep offered no escape. Every night, around 3:15 a.m., he would wake up to an intense feeling of pressure. As if a giant invisible hand was squeezing his tent. He'd scramble outside, flashlight cutting through the freezing mountain air. But there was never anything there. Just the ancient trees, standing like silent, black sentinels. But small things were out of place. He'd leave his boots outside the tent, heels facing in. In the morning, they'd be in the same spot, but turned around, pointing out into the woods. He left his surveyor tape coiled on a stump and found it the next day 10 feet away, draped over a branch in a perfect loop. He tried to rationalize it. "You're just exhausted," he told himself. "You're probably sleepwalking." He needed to hear a familiar voice, something to ground him in reality. He decided to call his wife, Sarah, on his satellite phone. On the 3rd try, the call connected. "Hey babe," David said, his voice strained. Her reply was shredded by static. "Yeah, it's me. The reception is garbage. How are the girls?" A long, unnerving pause followed. The static on the line didn't sound electronic. It sounded like breathing. Slow, heavy, rhythmic breathing. Then Sarah's voice came through, trembling with fear. "David, why are you calling me from the other room?" He froze, his blood turning to ice. "Sarah!" "What are you talking about?" "I'm in the mountains. I'm hours from any road." "Stop playing, Dave. It's not funny. I can see you in the hallway." "Why are you just standing there?" "Open the door." The line went dead. David stared at the phone, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He tried to redial, but the screen just said, "Nitrogen monoxide signal." He sat in his camp chair for the next 4 hours, bear spray clutched in his hand, his eyes burning as he stared into the unblinking darkness of the tree line. The true terror began on October 19th. While mapping a northern ridge, David stumbled upon the collapsed ruins of an old log cabin, nearly swallowed by the forest. It had to be over a century old. As he got closer, the low hum he'd been feeling for weeks intensified into a physical force. It wasn't a sound. it was a vibration that made his teeth ache and his vision shimmer. A wave of nausea washed over him, a known side effect of infrasound. But this felt different. It felt like the land itself was rejecting him. Inside the ruins, half buried in the dirt, he found an old leather-bound ledger. The paper was miraculously preserved. He carefully flipped to the last entry. The ink faded but still legible. It was dated November 1894. It read, "The trees are closer today. I measure them every morning. The gray oak has moved 4 inches toward the port since Tuesday. Elias says it is the wind, but there is no wind. The silence is eating the dogs. One by one, they stop barking. Then they simply walk into the brush and do not return. I fear if I close my eyes, I will wake up, and the woods will be inside the house." David dropped the book and scrambled back. He turned to hike back to his camp, but the trail he had just walked was gone. In its place was an impenetrable wall of laurel and rhododendron, a thicket that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in 100 years. He was an expert woodsman, but this was impossible. He pulled out his compass. The needle was spinning wildly, a frantic clockwise blur. He started hiking in what he thought was west, but the sun, a pale, sickly disk, refused to move. It hung in the same spot in the sky, never setting. That's when the panic finally hit him. He started to run, crashing through thorns that tore at his clothes and skin. He screamed for help, but the sound died in his throat, absorbed by the heavy, wool-like air. And then he saw it. He stopped at the edge of a clearing, 50 yards away. On the other side, a man stepped out from the trees. The man was wearing a bright orange jacket. He carried a surveyor's tripod over his shoulder. He had a slight limp in his left leg, the same limp David had from 4 years ago. It was David. This other David looked tired, real, and solid. He stopped, wiped sweat from his brow, and looked directly at the spot where our David was standing. But his eyes saw nothing. This other David sighed in frustration, glanced at a GPS unit in his hand, and muttered, "Great. Iron deposits." David tried to shout, to make a sound, but he had no breath. He could only watch in silent horror as his double turned and began hammering a survey stake into the ground in the exact same spot where he had stood 10 days before. The horrifying realization crashed down on him. He wasn't lost in the woods. He was lost in the static. This valley was a thin place, where time wasn't a straight line. It was a recording, looping and playing back, blurring the past and present into one terrifying, endless moment. He looked down at his own hands. They were becoming transparent. He could see the dead leaves on the forest floor right through his palms. On October 30th, a search and rescue team found David Thorne's camp. It was completely undisturbed. His coffee pot sat on the stove, half full of moldy liquid. His satellite phone was on his camp chair. When they called Sarah Thorne to tell her he was missing, she was quiet for a long time before she finally whispered. He called, but it wasn't him. He told me he was in the hallway. He told me to open the door, and when I looked, the hallway was full of leaves, just piles and piles of dead, brown leaves. David Thorne was never found. No body, no clothes, not even a single track leading away from his camp. But some hikers who venture into Devil's Throats still report strange things. If you stand very still near the ruins of that old cabin, they say you can sometimes hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a hammer hitting a metal stake. And if you look very closely into the trees, you might just see the figure of a man in a tattered orange jacket, standing just beyond the tree line, watching you with eyes that look like static, on a dead channel, forever waiting for someone else to hear the hum.